Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This is a webinar on Lorenz Lüthi's Cold Wars, Asia, the Middle East, Europe. I'm Eric Arneson from George Washington University, co-chairing the seminar with Christian Osterman. The seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. Behind the scenes are two people who make this possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And I'd like to thank two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous individual donors. And of course, we invite you to join their ranks. And just to let you know, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when it's time for questions, please use the raise hand button and we'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I will turn over the screen to Christian Osterman, who will be moderating today's session. Christian.
Christian, unmute yourself.
All right, sorry about that. Good to see everyone, see our co-panelists here, and to continue the Washington History Seminar series with what I think is a really exciting and important new publication that needs to be discussed, that ought to be discussed, and we will do this right here today. Let me just say up front, the idea for this is actually one of the co-panelists, Pierre Paquet, actually had the idea for this session. So thank you, Pierre, for suggesting it, and for Lorenz and Hope and Tim to agreeing to come and to provide an initial contribution to debate that we hope eventually to have with about 45 minutes in or so with many of our viewers. Lorenz's new book, Cold Wars, is a major historiographic intervention that focuses on, as he'll surely explain in just a few moments, the regional dynamics of the Cold War, how they impacted in turn the global narrative, but it also looks, I think importantly, at inter-regional dynamics, especially within the global South. That book, of course, is in conversation with a number of major publications, overviews of the Cold War, by Mel Leffler, Arnie Westad, John Gaddis, and others, which for the most part have been focused on the Soviet-American rivalry. So Lorenz takes a sharp turn here, and with that, I turn the floor over to him. Lorenz is a longtime partner in Cold War research. He is now associate professor at McGill University in Montreal, a leading historian of the Cold War, no doubt. His first book, The Sino-Soviet Split, The Cold War in the Communist World, published 12 years ago, won the 2008 Furnace Award and the 2010 Marshall Schulman Prize. He's also got a number of articles and other publications out on the Vietnam War, Asian African internationalism, and his work has generally broken new ground in Cold War history. With that, Lorenz, the floor is yours for about 10 minutes or so. I'll get really nervous sort of 10 minutes in so we can keep to the schedule and then open it up to everyone. Lorenz, congratulations, and floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And welcome to all to this roundtable. I'm very glad to see so many participants, at least virtually. I'm of course also grateful to the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing the roundtable, to Pierre Paquet, who came up with the original idea, and to Hope Harrison and Tim Naftali, who enthusiastically agreed to participate. So I have now around 10 minutes to talk about my book, Cold Wars, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. This is in fact the first time I talk about this book in public. It's over 4 months after I received the first hard copies in my mail. This was exactly one day before the lockdown in Canada that started on March 13th. So what's the book about? Essentially, the book emerged from my growing unease about how we as historians conduct research on the Cold War and how we teach it, particularly at the undergraduate level, mainly through the lens of the great powers, or mostly actually the lens of the superpowers. And let me explain my unease with a metaphor. In 1986, a musical by two former members of the Swedish rock band ABBA came to stage in London. Its title is Chess. It's the story of a fictional Soviet-American chess tournament that symbolically stands for the superpowers. The chess metaphor is not new, of course, but it's really revealing. Two players, the two superpowers, sitting opposite of each other playing chess. The chess pieces, their respective allies and friends in international relations, are lifeless figures to be moved around and sacrificed if necessary. They don't have a life by themselves. No agenda, no goals, nothing. Let's develop this metaphor a little bit. Let's assume that the chess pieces are in fact alive, that they are little critters and animals with a will of their own. As the superpowers move them around on a chessboard, these living chess pieces quickly start to crawl or walk away from their positions. The superpowers, of course, react by holding them down or building walls, but soon they run out of fingers and hands to do so. Occasionally, one of the superpowers uses a fly swat to crush one of those venturing too far from the chessboard. This is exactly how the Cold War looks. The Cold War I describe in my book actually looks like. Now, when you read the 3 volumes of Khrushchev's Presidium documents in Russian, or the decades of national security conversations in Frus, you will see that more often than not, the superpowers react to developments instead of shaping them. They react to crises which were often not of their own making. If this is really the case, our focus as historians should be on those who created this crisis, i.e. the countries at the periphery of the former communist world, from Asia to the Middle East and to Europe. They had their own histories and their own agendas, and they often co-opted the Cold War to their own advantage. Now, my claim is not new. I don't claim that this is new, since all the 3 commentators today at this roundtable have written case studies with this in mind. However, what we need to do is to integrate the research of regional and national studies into a global picture, which is what I try to do in my book. So let me quickly review what are the findings. What did I find when I wrote the book? Now, first of all, smaller and middle powers substantially changed the nature of the Cold War over time, to such a degree that by the late 1970s and the early 1980s, the regional incarnations of the global Cold War were basically fading away, particularly in the Middle East and in Europe. So the question here is not why did the Cold War really end suddenly in 1989? The question is then, why did it take so long for it to end, when the structures of the original endings of the Cold War were actually already in place? Now, the second finding, I think, is that regional developments influenced each other, with influence usually moving from east to west around the periphery of the communist world, i.e. from Asia to the Middle East and Europe, and from the Middle East to Europe. This is also the reason why I place the chapters on Asia and Middle East in the book before those on Europe, which is also another attempt to decenter, in fact, the Cold War and make it less Eurocentric. Now, finally, the big 3 in the early Cold War and then the 2 superpowers tried to influence existing developments. There's no doubt about that. And this is the case, for example, in modern nation formation in China and Vietnam, South Asia, the Middle East, and even in Europe. And they tried to do so to take advantage of these developments. In general, I concluded the United States tried to co-opt developments more often, while the Soviet Union intervened more deeply when it intervened. Of course, there are notable exceptions, I understand that. But in general, my sense is that the United States pursued a semi-hands-on policy and the USSR applied an all-hands-on policy. In the end, however, co-optation worked better than direct intervention in most cases, which is one of the reasons why the United States was generally more successful in the Cold War. But this still means that we have to explain in the first place the developments which the superpowers co-opted or tried to change through intervention, and how regional actors resisted or co-opted superpower engagement or intervention, individually and collectively. That should be the focus of our research. Now, before I conclude, I want to leave you with a counterfactual question. And you might mull about this during this seminar or in the next couple of weeks. Just think about the following. How would the Cold War have looked like if somebody like Gorbachev had been Stalin's successor in 1953 instead of Khrushchev and then Brezhnev? I have asked this question many of my colleagues, and their answers were surprisingly uniform. If you answer by arguing, or if you here answer by arguing that the course of the Cold War would have not been significantly different, or that the Cold War would not have ended earlier and in a peaceful manner, then you need to read my book. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenz, for this very succinct overview and hopefully provoking some discussion. We now turn to our first panelist, commentator, Professor Hope Harrison, Professor of History and International Affairs at the George Washington University in Washington. She is author of Driving the Soviets Up the Wall, Soviet-East German Relations, 1953, and After the Berlin Wall, Memory and the Making of the New Germany, 1989 to the Present, published just last year. She's also the co-chair of the History and Public Policy Programs Advisory Board, a former Wilson alumna. So we're delighted to have her on board here, and she will talk about, I think, the European piece in all of this, which Lorenz, you've sort of put at the end of the agenda. So Hope, where should it be?
Well, first, let me recommend to everyone this very weighty, thick book of over 600 pages, over 100 endnotes. It is a magisterial work, a massive undertaking. Where others might have shied away from delving deeply and broadly into three large theaters of the Cold War, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, Lorenz dove right in, and this is the result. To do this, he spent years in 24 archives on 4 continents, bolstered by his language abilities in English, French, German, Russian, and Chinese. So that, of course, feels like another life with our world of COVID right now. We're all missing working in the archives, and I'm sure Lorenz is incredibly happy he's done with all of that research. Both during and particularly after the end of the Cold War and the opening of communist bloc archives, scholars all over the world, myself included, have written about the role of small and medium powers in the Cold War. Lorenz brings that all together in one place, and he expands on it by using a massive number of archival sources and by drawing new conclusions. He shows how developments in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe interacted with and impacted each other, and how they caused structural changes in the Cold War and ultimately brought it to an end. Decentering the Cold War from the US-Soviet conflict yields a much richer, more true-to-life international portrayal of this period. And it shows how far we've come since John Lewis Gaddis wrote about the long peace in 1986 in his article in International Security and his book the following year. People in Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa certainly didn't feel that this period was one of a long peace. And Lorenz goes into great detail on some of that in his book. I also have to say, even though Lorenz doesn't talk about this in the book, that this book really fits in with the current moment by showing how so many non-whites experienced and impacted the Cold War in this period. The combination of his specific case studies, I think there are 15 chapters that deal with very specific aspects of the Cold War. The combination of these with broader chapters and interpretations, I think yields a book that would be really perfect to use in an undergraduate course on the international history of the Cold War. So I'm gonna focus on one particular case of how what Lorenz writes about was so essential to understanding the Cold War. And this is the impact of what was happening in Asia, in Europe, and on the US. And in particular, as he talks about the watershed moment of the North Korean attack on the South. This attack in 1950 came when West Germany had just been created the year before. NATO had just been created the year before. But West Germany did not have a military force and was not in NATO. Well, the impact of communist North Korea's attack on South Korea ultimately changed that situation massively for Germany, for Europe, and for NATO. Adenauer, the leader of West Germany, had said that he didn't think a state could be a state without military force. And he, from the beginning, really wanted West Germany to have military force, and he wanted to persuade Europeans and Germans of this. The French were, of course, against this. The vast majority of the West German people were against any rearmament of West Germany. But in the wake of the North Korean attack, Adenauer could act on what he had wanted and could use it to get more sovereignty from the US, Great Britain, and France in West Germany. And so Adenauer was able to deftly use developments on the other side of the world in Asia to get what he wanted in Germany. And many in Washington wanted the same. Dean Acheson and others felt that building up a strong Western alliance against the Soviets, they were gonna need some German help. In fact, at one point, Adenauer said, will you really not allow us to defend ourselves if East Germany does what the North Koreans have just done? And in a memoranda to the US, Britain, and France on August 29th of 1950, he went into detail about the impact of the Korean War on developments in Europe and in Germany. The first sentence of that said, developments in the Far East have unleashed concern and insecurity among the German people. And he went into great detail of the police forces, the military forces that were being developed in East Germany, all the Soviet troops in East Germany, and said, you know, you've got to let us do something. And ultimately, in late 1954 and 55, that was worked out. It took France a while to agree. And Lorenz writes about that. And in 1950, West Germany was admitted to NATO. So this is just one of the many really important issues that Lorenz writes about in this book that show how interconnected different regions of the world were in the Cold War, and that you can't understand these things separately. To get a really complete picture, you need to look at the interaction among these things. Lorenz also does a really good job of writing across the Cold War time-wise. He starts earlier. He really starts in 1917, as John Lewis Gaddis has at times, Jonathan Haslam, Arnie Wested, you know, putting this in a broader context. And then he goes beyond the end of the Cold War and talks about the lessons and legacies. So I will end with two questions for Lorenz before we go on to Pierre and Tim. Lorenz, individuals, you mention individuals sometimes, but they don't play a great role in your story. You, of course, mention Nasser, Nehru, Gorbachev, and others. So I'm wondering what you think the role of individuals was during the Cold War, and are there certain conditions where you think there was more of a chance for individuals to play a Cold War? And my second question has to do with the decision you made to have chapters on the European community and European integration and Comic-Con, but not instead of, instead of perhaps NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Did you decide, my impression is you decided to focus on those two more economic organizations, because ultimately your argument as to why the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, you make the point the US didn't win it, but the Soviets did lose it primarily for economic reasons. And I'm wondering if that is how we should understand your decision to vote chapters to the European community and Comic-Con instead of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Hope. Lorenz, do you want to respond to those questions directly,
okay,
briefly?
Yeah, very briefly. A role of individuals. As you said, the book is an undergraduate text, and I really tried to avoid to have too many people showing up because it's confusing. And I wanted to have the story out there, and once students get into the topic of one of the chapters, they will encounter these individuals. I also didn't try to, I tried not to mention other historians. I said, according to a famous historian. So I wanted to reduce the number of particular foreign names as a service to make this more readable to undergraduate students and to an interested lay public. Yes, I think the role of chance is important with personalities. I think, that Brandt became West German Chancellor in 1969, and it was absolutely crucial. There's no doubt in my mind. And so this is why he's also in there, right? Well, about economic versus military, we have a substantial amount of literature on military alliances. I thought for two reasons why I would focus on economics, or three. One is economics really matter to me, in terms of the end of the Cold War. It's also a coming field. I wanted to make sure that we now really engage with this coming field. And there are two other reasons. One is I was quite shocked personally by Brexit. I was in the UK. I could vote because I was a Canadian citizen. I was surprised. And I thought, one of the reasons why Brexit happens is there's a lack of understanding of the long-term project, why this is there in the first place. A complete lack of understanding throughout, in fact, most of Europe among the younger people. And finally, I wanted to write about CMEA because nobody has really written about this on the basis on research, and I basically mined the East German archives to that end. And I wanted to do this in comparative terms. Why was one successful and why did the other one not work out?
Great, thank you. We'll now turn to Pierre Paquet, who is the Dwight E. Stanford Chair in U.S. Foreign Relations at San Diego State University. He's the author of A Bitter Peace, Washington, Hanoi, and the Making of the Paris Agreement, published in 2002. Hanoi's Road to the Vietnam War, published 1954 to 1965, published in 2013. And Vietnam's American War, A History, published 2 years ago. And he's also co-editor of a forthcoming Cambridge History of the Vietnam War. Pierre, it's great to have you as part of this panel. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, and thanks for doing all the hard work in terms of putting this together. I think you, Christian, Peter, Rachel, Eric. I mean, I can't thank you enough for bringing us together to discuss what, I mean, as Hope has said, I mean, is a really remarkable book. You know, you read some books on occasion and you think, if I knew what's in here, I mean, I would be one of the smartest professors of international relations history on the planet. And I really felt that way reading your book, Lorenz. It's just astounding how much material is in there, and yet how lucid the narrative remains. And I think, you know, one of the things that I think, because of the way that we're trained as scholars, you know, where you know we start with kind of a general education, become increasingly focused the longer we're in school. I think that given that type of training, we sometimes fail to search for kind of longer distance connections between our topics and other events and circumstances worldwide. And I think what your book shows really well is the importance of covering that distance, of trying to figure out, if we're studying the Korean War, trying to figure out very well what exactly is happening elsewhere around the world, because you know, I think there's so many connections that your book traces that I'd never considered before between my topic, Vietnam, and other parts of the world, and I think that's one of the values of your book. Beyond that, and again, Hope touched upon this, you know, in terms of decentering the Cold War. I mean, we've been trying to do that for quite some time, but I think that we've failed more than we've succeeded. I think Pierre Grosser did a really good job in his book on Asia at decentering the history of the 20th century, but specifically the history of the Cold War. But again, it was through a focus on Asia. And what you do here is really, by looking at the world generally, with the exception of a couple of places, you attempt that and you succeed remarkably well. And you know, well organized and written as your book is, you when you're done reading it, I mean, it's basically, the Cold War was a really messy affair, right? And I think for too long we've oversimplified it. And beyond that, this idea of a long peace or the Cold War as something that's the product of a Soviet-American rivalry just grossly oversimplifies all that was happening around the world, right? And I like you know, your analogy, right? The chessboard. But that's the thing. I mean, it's a chessboard that's so much bigger than the analogy suggests, with so many more pieces than a chess game would entail. So I, you know, I mean, the roots of certain alignments, right? I mean, you present those so well, right? I mean, how does kind of, you know, Pakistan end up being so close to China? How does India end up connecting to Egypt? How do Yugoslavia how do Yugoslavia and Egypt then kind of get in bed together? And again, right, we're aware of these alignments, of these alliances, but I think that we've often kind of failed to ask how they came about, right? We take them for granted sometimes, and your book again, in remarkably lucid fashion, shows how these things came about. And I really loved that. I mean, I learned so much about the world, including about Southeast Asia, which I thought I knew, given my own work. Suez in '56. Again, right? I mean, I knew Suez '56 was meaningful in a regional context, but I mean, you present it as a seminal development in the Cold War, and I mean, and you do that very, very convincingly. And so I can't wait now to kind of go back to class, or at least virtual class, and kind of steal some of your ideas without giving you credit to kind of enhance my courses. I might give you credit, but we'll see about that. But seriously, the Suez '56 crisis, and how it kind of you say that basically by '57, more largely because of the crisis, we have the structure of the global Cold War effectively in place, because the Brits are now effectively out, and imperialism is out, kind of as a global force. I thought that was really, really interesting. I really loved your assessment of the Asian African movement, not the Afro-Asian movement, but the Asian African movement and the non-aligned movement. I think we always conflate the two, right? We always equate the two. And you demonstrate very, very well that there are two very, very different movements that intended to serve very different purposes. Just because there's overlap in terms of membership does not mean that they serve the same mission. And again, I think just those two chapters on the Asian African movement and the non-aligned movement, I think really open our eyes to the need to much more seriously engage the third world, right? Again, like, we think we understand it, and then you read your chapters, and we realize, wow, we still have so much to learn about the Cold War, about the third world, and therein, right, is another reason why we should kind of continue these efforts to decenter the Cold War. Vietnam validating the domino theory. I think it's a really bold argument. It's one I believe, but I've never really dared making. You make it, and I'm grateful for that, because now I can cite you, and then you can deal with the repercussions. But I completely agree with you. And this idea, right, of Vietnamese communists bent on global hegemony and seriously committed to world revolution, I think you're spot on. I think that we've been so obsessed with regarding the Vietnamese as nationalists, Vietnamese communists as nationalists, that we've overlooked the fact that they were communists and internationalists. And again, I mean, it shows that just how closely you studied your material, that you actually make significant contributions to our understanding of fields that are really kind of beyond your own, right? And as Hope has suggested, I mean, it just, to me, it demonstrates just how meticulous you were in your research. Couple of questions that I'm going to end here. You talked about a counterfactual. Let me present you with one. What would the Cold War have looked like without the Sino-Soviet split? I think that you maybe underestimate the place of the Sino-Soviet split in the global Cold War. And I mean, you've written about the Sino-Soviet split. So I wonder, is this deliberate or so? But to me, right, I feel that a lot of what Moscow does starting in the 60s is really prompted by what the Chinese are doing and saying about the Soviet Union. I'm not sure that there would have been a war in Vietnam had it not been for the Sino-Soviet split and Chinese radicalism. And so I'm just curious as to maybe why you seem to kind of put China with the rest of the third world, when I'm thinking maybe it deserves its own place between maybe the world and then the Soviets and the Americans in the context of the Cold War. And then when you look at the Middle East, you talk about the Cold War in the Middle East, and you underscore some of the legacies of the Cold War in the region. And I'd be curious, Lawrence, if you think, as I always thought, that maybe what the Cold War also does in the Middle East is it validates and it enables, I guess it validates the intractable positions of the different players, right? And it turns these conflicts into extremely violent conflicts, which again would have been different without the Cold War. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. Lawrence, just outstanding job.
Great, thank you, Pierre. Can I sign up for that class of yours? Because that looks like so much fun, just listening to you. Lawrence, over to you.
Well, thank you for the praise. I hope I will get also criticism here. Very quickly, I'm guilty as charged. I mixed up Asian African internationalism and non-alignment in my Sino-Soviet split book too. So somebody pointed this out, which was then the reason I started to do research. I also have to say, there's really a younger generation of Cold War historians who really do now the Global South and decenter. I have seen several dissertations now, brand new dissertations, and I'm very excited to see that. So, I'm not the only one who carries the banner. There's a whole, actually, a whole row of young Cold War historians on either side here, and we are marching together. So the Cold War, the counterfactual, the Cold War without the Sino-Soviet split. Now, first of all, I do find, I have written about the Sino-Soviet split, and then there's the tendency that you might actually want just to write the second volume of it, and I tried to prevent this from happening. I wanted really to do something new. And I was to a certain degree also actually tired about the Sino-Soviet split. I didn't want to be Mr. Sino-Soviet split for the rest of my career. But I do write how important the Sino-Soviet split is to force the hand of the Soviets, and why this played a role in the intervention in '68 in Czechoslovakia to basically shore up a rump socialist camp, and how this then actually makes the rump socialist camp, i.e. the Soviet Union and East Europe and some other retainers, makes it essentially unreformable, and it sort of makes sure that this whole thing is going down the drain in the long term. Of course, I think the Sino-Soviet split really changed the way the Cold War went in Asia. Would it have changed the way of the Cold War in Europe? I really have to think this through, right? Because now we have counterfactual on top of counterfactual. Yes, I agree that the Cold War deepens actually conflicts in the Middle East, but all of these conflicts existed before, right? It's again, the cooptation of existing conflicts by the superpowers, and then in return, how actually local actors try to manipulate the superpowers. It's not only Egypt. I mean, we know that in Israel, in case of Israel, Michael Schönbaum has written about this around 20 years ago, but virtually every single actually actor there tries to do that. But how, with the rise of pan-Islamism, which you didn't mention, that's the chapter after non-alignment, how with pan-Islamism you have now a movement that tries to transcend the Cold War and brings about the end of the Cold War in the Middle East. It's just essentially steps outside of the paradigm. It doesn't want to have anything to do with the Cold War, particularly the Saudi version and the Iranian, of course, as it arises then in '79.
Great, thank you. Finally, but certainly not least, and I am truly very excited to have with us Timothy Naftali, Clinical Associate Professor of Public Service at New York University. He is also a leading scholar of the Cold War, co-author with Alexander Fursenko of the classic One Hell of a Gamble, Khrushchev, Castro, and Kennedy, 1958 to 1964, published in 1997. Khrushchev's Cold War, published in 2006. Author of a biography of George Herbert Walker Bush, and he is about to finish a biography of JFK as president. Tim is the founding director of the Federal Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. He served in that capacity until 2011. Since then, in addition to many other things, he's become a talking head on CNN. So we see a lot of you, but we see you less so in these circles. So I'm so excited to have you here, Tim. A warm welcome to you, and over to you.
Thank you, Christian. And And it's really a pleasure. I want to thank all the organizers for this. It's also been a pleasure to read Lorenz's book. As he mentioned, some of us have been trying to surprise by showing that the Kremlin and that Washington was not always, in fact, was rarely in control of events. What I love about this book is that he has created a symphony. He uses a musical analogy. By the way, I love the musical chess, but he brings the ring cycle into this. Music matters a lot to him, but he's created a symphony, and he's shown how all of these players, in the most important players in Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe, are all seeking their own objectives while in the context of the Cold War. I have some questions for Lorenz. You can't read a book like this, a really great book like this, without being motivated to ask many questions. Because in telling the story, I suspect he learned things. It wasn't just that he learned them while doing research. I think that as he pieced it together, the synergies created by doing so taught him things. And so I want to tease out from him some of the elements that I saw in the mosaic that he created. One of the sub-themes of this book for me, reading it, was the role of radicalism and status quo powers in this era. And the reader will be surprised by who the radical, I mean, scholars, most of us aren't surprised, but I think many readers, particularly high school students or college students or the general population, might be surprised by who the radicals are and the role that they play in goosing the system. And so Lorenz has some very good work on the Vietnamese, on the Chinese when they were radical, on the Egyptians when they were radical. Though he does not cover Latin America, he mentions the Cubans every so often. These are radical actors in this story who cause trouble for both status quo superpowers. Now, the Soviets and the Americans have their moments of intense activity, as Lorenz alluded earlier, but in many cases, they want to preserve the system. And these actors are trying to change the rules of the game, particularly when you get into the détente period. The question I have for Lorenz is the role of ideology in this radicalism, as opposed to old-fashioned national, as they would define it, national interest. The Vietnamese are definitely hugely committed to an internationalist project, but it's really locally based. They're not seeking to create a Vietnamese colony in Africa. They really want communism throughout Southeast Asia. So to what extent is this just regional hegemony by Vietnam as opposed to an internationalist project? The Cubans seem to have been involved in an internationalist project. They were not trying to set up a colony in Angola, for example, or in Benin. But the Vietnamese seem to have been involved in a hegemonic project. Similarly, although you don't spend much time on them, the Indonesians are involved in a hegemonic project, which they use the Cold War to take advantage, Sukarno does, to take advantage of situations, opportunities. So one of the beauties of this book is it raises, I think, a very useful question about the role of ideology and the role of national interest. It also raises the issue of idealism, which is different from ideology. And that idealism, we've mentioned it up to now, but I'd like to focus a little bit more on it. The question of the non-aligned movement and the Asian African movement. it is so interesting. And from my reading of the book, the major difference between these two movements is Tito, is the fact that the Yugoslavs cannot be part of the Asian African movement. But the rise and fall of these two movements has a lot to do, from the book, with the interests of the major leaders promoting them. Nehru's ideas are so important. Nehru's change in his policy towards China, going from being supportive of China to after fighting China to being against China. The shift of the players in their own national interests affects their commitment to the idealism of internationalism. So the spirit of Bandung has its limits, and those limits are drawn by national state interests. Again, that's suggested by this. I'm not saying that's the argument Lorenz makes, but one is driven, as one reads these really important chapters on those internationalist efforts, one is driven, one is led to see how they're undermined by the very leaders who set them in motion in the first place. One of the other takeaways for me is again, when we're not talking about the Soviet Union and the United States, thank goodness, it's a relief. When we look at all the other players, what we see is this phenomenon of very strong leaders and very weak states. These are leaders with broad objectives, who need resources to achieve these objectives, who have historical legacies they are seeking to bring to life or to justify or legitimate. They need help, and they draw the superpowers in, needing money from the superpowers, needing assistance. And so I guess it's a minor, it's not a criticism, but a question for Lorenz is, to what extent are we really talking about a Cold War in the Middle East? To what extent, as you beautifully explain, all of the pieces, all of the tensions predate the Cold War, but the players in fighting the wars that they would have fought anyway bring the superpowers in to make themselves stronger and more effective. So you argue in the book that by the 1980s, the structure of the Cold War had disappeared in the Middle East. Couldn't you argue that it never actually existed at all? That in fact, what was happening was Nasser and Ben Gurion and Iraq and Syria were at different times trying to take advantage of the fact that you had two wealthy powers that needed prestige and were vulnerable to a good ask. So I want to end with this last point, which is the role of economics. Lorenz, as we said, talks about Comecon, he talks about the European Union, European community. His conclusion talks about the importance of economics, certainly in the collapse of Eastern Europe. But let me ask him the extent to which the Cold War was shaped by economic, not the economic requirements of hegemony, but the basic shifts in the international economy after World War II. And I asked that in partial answer to his question about Gorbachev, which is, I wonder if it would have been possible for a Gorbachev to appear after Stalin, because the questions that Gorbachev raised could really only have been raised as a result of the collapse of the Soviet experiment after the industrial era had ended. And with that, I just want to again congratulate Lorenz on a beautiful book, and a book we're going to be talking about for a long time, and today too.
Thanks, Tim. That's wonderful comments. Lorenz, over to you.
I fear you raised so many questions that it would take up 1 or 2 hours. So maybe, I just pick 1 or 2. At the very beginning, you talk about the mosaic, and the whole project started 15 years ago when I was as I was finishing my dissertation, as it was turned into a book manuscript. And I was pushed a little bit by my advisor to write the second volume and sign a regulation. And I settled on a topic on structural thinking in the Cold War in the 60s and 70s. And as I did research, it slowly actually increased and increased and increased. It became bigger and bigger and bigger. And to a certain degree, it's just the things you find in the archive that give you new ideas. And you go with really open eyes and you don't just cherry pick what you want to see, and you just sniff through and read and read. That grew. And you're right, as you are, in fact, writing, you suddenly see connections which you haven't seen. And this happened to me too. Now, this is not the last, I hope this is not the last word on the topic. So I hope that what we have is what we have today, an ongoing discussion. This is not, if I had added chapters on Latin America and Africa, my editor would have rejected this book. So, and I also didn't want this to be an encyclopedic book. I wanted this to be an argument-driven book where people can react and reject my argument, maybe with other cases. You know, I'm very happy about this. So I want to have actually a debate now. Yes. I also want to say here, I learned from the three of you enormously, and because you particularly, you know, Pierre is working on North Vietnam and Hope on East Germany, and Tim on Cuba. You know, these are to certainly actually three books that inspired this my own book now. So I have to mention this here too. Ideology, radicalism. I agree, Cuba had an international project, very clearly one in Africa, all over Africa, in Northern Africa, at the Horn, in Angola, of course. How about the Vietnamese? Of course, they didn't want to create colonies, but in the 60s and 70s, I mean, they are not settled revolutionary states, unlike Cuba. They are still in revolution. They very clearly saw themselves as a part of a world revolutionary movement, of a network of like-minded movements, a loose network, not centrally actually run. And they had contacts with the Palestinians, of course, with the Algerians, with the Chinese, with Africans. They helped each other where they could, but it was mostly at the rhetorical level. They reinforced a message they already had, and they tried to encourage each other to continue their bit, their contribution to the world revolution. In that way, they are different from the Cubans. The Cubans had a revolutionary state. They had a secure basis from which they could operate. That was not the case with North Vietnam until '75. And I think then it becomes a more local or regional, actually hegemonic project. But again, it's about regionally promoting world revolution, right? So there's always this connection. I hope I didn't answer all of the questions, but I'm sure we will talk about this in the future.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks very much, Lorenz. We now open it up for questions from our viewers on Facebook and on Zoom. Please use the function to raise your hand on Zoom, and I'll try to call on you. And I've also got a couple of people who wrote messages to me, so we'll try to do this. Please mute yourself, yes, or you will be muted so that we have a clear connection. With that, let me call on our first questioner, Jim Hirschberg.
Hi, everybody. It is a great Can you hear me, Christian?
We can hear you now. Yes, you were muted there for a moment, but I think we're
okay.
good now.
Okay, first of all, thanks so much for organizing this terrific event. We indeed could go on for hours more. It's great to see my friends and colleagues, at least virtually. And I'm very excited to read Lorenz's book, which I've ordered. Of course, I've read and every year assigned The Split. So, you know, I'm sure it will be terrific. I have one very quick comment and one very quick question. So it will be very un-Hirschbergian in terms of length. The comment regards the counterfactual that Lorenz raised at the beginning. What if you had had a Gorbachev succeed Stalin? Well, I think there really is a very good comparison to be made between Khrushchev's actions in 53 to 56 and Gorbachev between 86 and 89, as I thought at the time. But the real counterfactual in my mind is, what if Khrushchev had not intervened to crush the Hungarian uprising? Would you have seen a chain reaction that would have led to some version of 1989 in 1956? Because that came very close to happening had not the Soviets intervened. And my question for Lorenz is the following. I know he did not add Latin America to his analysis for reasons of length. I'm currently working on a book that focuses on Latin America. And I'm just wondering, does he really see Latin America and the Cold War as susceptible to the same, more or less the same analysis that he engaged in for East Asia and Africa during this period? Or does he sense anything especially distinctive about the relationship, the interrelationship between Latin America and the Cold War?
Thanks, Jim. Jim Hirschberg, of course, being the former director of the Cold War International History Project at the Wilson Center, and now professor at GW. Lorenz, over to you.
Okay, a quick comment on Gorbachev becoming a successor of Stalin. Of course, you know, this would have not happened because somebody like him would have not made it to the top of the system. But my point is also that Gorbachev wasn't really, you know, the kind of reformer or, you know, the Democrat we remember him. He just became this only by 1988, right? So in that way, my answer is, in details, the Cold War would have changed, but in its overall shape, it wouldn't, because Eisenhower would have not trusted Gorbachev anyway, and alliance building around the Soviet Union would have continued, right? Which was about to end by 55, right? I mean, this was why Khrushchev started actually with the thaw in order to prevent this from happening in the first place. Now, what would have happened if the Soviet Union would not have intervened in Hungary? It's a counterfactual, of course, but I do find it probably would have provided, created a ripple effect. It would have had probably an impact back on Poland. I'm not quite sure about Czechoslovakia, because Czechoslovakia is oddly always out of step, you know, until, you know, in the 50s and 60s, does always the opposite of what Hungary and Poland does, right? So maybe it would have had an influence on Romania, I don't know. East Germany, we had 53 in uprising, right? If at least the Soviets would have probably intervened there if there had been an effect actually on East Germany. So Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa in general, you know, this is really an argument-driven book. I didn't want this to be an encyclopedia. So the idea here is, you know, who's changing actually the structure of the Cold War so that the superpowers actually get to a point where they have to end it. And I thought, you know, that the periphery of the communist world is the place where this happened. This is where mutual influence happened. There's a lot of influence in Latin America and on Sub-Saharan Africa, and it created a lot of suffering, there's no doubt. But I don't see necessarily how Angola or Chile has an impact on China in the 1970s, or necessarily on Europe. What I want to see is a back and forth of influence between the regions. Now, in terms of Latin America, I'm not a Latin American specialist at all, and I'm now reading up to get on up to speed. But my sense is that Latin America has such long-lasting developments coming out of the 19th century. It has its own left-right antagonism tied to economic structures, that the Cold War does intervene, but it's not really the backyard actually of the United States. The United States intervenes, but there are so many actually developments that are so distinct to that South America, that I think it's actually a special case in international relations. So that's sort of my short answer.
Thanks, Lorenz. Next we go to David Kanan. If you could please introduce yourself just briefly to the panelists before asking your question.
First, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's very interesting. I'm a former CIA analyst, retired, and I teach at Johns Hopkins SAIS adjunct. A question on the counterfactual, the challenge that Lorenz made to us at the end of this presentation. I'm not sure Khrushchev is the right analog here. I wonder, believe it or not, if it's Beria. Of course, Beria the monster compared to Khrushchev, who's now the great icon of Western nostalgia. I know that's sort of counterintuitive. There were the stories, at least, that Beria was interested in retrenchment during the short time between Stalin's death and his own execution, that he had talked about retrenchment, perhaps in Germany, and that domestic policies suddenly he's trying to suggest that he was going to protect people's rights and everything. I understand these are just stories and it's not a conclusive, there's not a lot of conclusive evidence on that, but asking the question in the spirit of counterfactuals, if Beria had survived and actually won the succession, would there have been any slight comparisons between the actual policies he would have followed internationally and maybe domestically, probably not domestically, but at least internationally, and some of those that Gorbachev adopted, granting that the times, as Professor Naftali pointed out, the times are very different in the 1980s and the 1950s. Thank you.
Lorenz, please go ahead.
All right.
You could keep your answers succinct.
Start with a counterfactual. A lot of people come up with counterfactuals too, I understand. I don't think so that with Beria a lot would have changed. I mean, he wanted to change. He wanted, as you say, retrenchment. He tried actually to take, to sort of let off speed domestically with some reform. At least we see this maybe in some form or another. Again, the evidence isn't very conclusive. But keep in mind, he was the person who pushed actually the new course on Albania, Hungary, and East Germany, with the result that actually East Germany went up in flames more or less in 1953. So he would have to deal with the fallout as well. The fact is that the fallout of East Germany basically was his end in the Soviet Union. So I don't see him as a reformer, because if you look at his whole career, he just doesn't strike me as the material for a reformer at all. He is really a diehard Stalinist. I think the West actually probably helped with Khrushchev ultimately.
Thank you. Next we go to Agnik Bhattacharya. Are you there?
I'm there.
Please introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, I'm a grad student from Delhi University, India, and I have a small question for the author. First of all, I'd like to congratulate him for this wonderful publication, and it's a very important work in the field of Cold War studies. In this session, we have mostly talked about the problems of Cold War in Europe and Asia. While talking about Asia, you have talked about China, Vietnam, and other places. I would like to know what would have been the nature of Cold War without the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and hadn't it become the new playground for not only political but also ideological warfare for both the Soviets and the Americans. I mean, without the intervention of the Soviets and the Americans in Afghanistan for changing the academic, social, and political culture of Afghanistan, the Cold War had a huge impact in Afghanistan, and it not only changed the history of Afghanistan but also the history of Central Asia and South Asia. So have you discussed this in your book?
Thank you, Lorenz.
So first of all, I see Afghanistan actually in a wider Middle Eastern context. I will mention it is, I think, in chapter 20, the end of the Cold War in the Middle East, and I really see this as a very large, actually, territory. Now, Afghanistan is really the odd case out in the Middle East, because it's the only actually Cold War conflict to a certain degree, and that goes back to something Tim said before, you know, to what degree do we speak about the Cold War in the Middle East in the first place? And my answer is that different levels of intensity of the Cold War in Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. Now, the Afghanistan war, you know, in my view, served as a catalyst in terms of the downfall of the Soviet Union, or convinced the Soviet Union. So it's another reason to convince the Soviet Union to end the Cold War. The problems the Soviet Union faced in the 1980s, it already faced in the 1970s. These were economic, they were structural, and you know, Afghanistan just actually accelerated, actually, made the slope downward actually just steeper. In that way, I don't think so. It makes a big difference. It makes a difference maybe in a couple of years. We've had Afghanistan, the Soviet Union might have collapsed, you know, maybe in the mid-90s. You know, I just speculate here, but it doesn't really change radically the story, in my view.
Thank you. Next, we have, I want to call on Sarang Shidora. Sorry for butchering that name, but Sarang, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, an excellent book. I appreciate add to the appreciation of others. My question is about, did you see any difference in terms of how these middle powers or smaller actors behaved in terms of whether they were in a formal alliance structure like NATO or like the Warsaw Pact, or like the US-Japan or US-Korea alliances, or they were not? So they were more informally aligned, like maybe Egypt was, or Syria was, for example, closer or with a tilt towards Moscow or Washington. Did that factor in terms of how much autonomy they exercised and how much they were able to set their own agendas and make the superpowers follow that? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Lorenz?
It's a huge question because we have different alliances and they have different characteristics. I mean, the Warsaw Pact, which is run by the Soviet Union, and they have CENTO, for example, the Baghdad Pact in the Middle East, which is a very loose alliance. Let me just pick out two examples. Germany, as a member of NATO is absolutely important for Germany to be rearmed and to be actually re-accepted in the circle of West European countries. So it had a function for Germany to basically get legitimacy and credibility, and it never wanted to gamble this away. When we think about Pakistan as another example, the motivation to join Western alliances, it was the most allied, American allied. It was allied 3 times, once directly with the United States, once via the Baghdad Pact, and once via Seattle. The reason why it entered the alliance is one, anti-Indian motivations, but also it had its own pan-Islamist ideas in the 40s and 50s, which sort of faltered by 53. And as the Baghdad Pact idea actually arises, we then seize actually Baghdad Pact as a potential avenue to revive its own pan-Islamist ideas, which only died in 56 for unrelated reasons. So many of these allies, whether they're formal or informal, join alliances with their own agenda and then exploit it either in the alliance, either in the spirit of the alliance or against the spirit of the alliance. These are just the examples, you know. But it's a very, very broad question, so it's really hard to answer it quickly.
Great. Thanks so much. Next, I'd like to call on Ellie Coe. Ellie?
Yes, hello. My name is Ellie Coe, and I'm currently an intern at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I really enjoyed what you were saying about the Sino-Soviet split, and I'm interested, if we're thinking about counterfactual history, how Yugoslavia, if it had remained aligned with the Soviet Union, would have affected the Cold War.
All right, thank you. I have actually never thought about that. So I sort of have to run now through my notes in my brain. I think it would have had a major impact in terms of the non-alignment, because Yugoslavia and Egypt were the 2 states that pushed for the non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement to a certain degree was important in the 60s, in the 70s, and it declines in importance, largely seized by the radicals in the system. So definitely that would have an impact. To what degree Yugoslavia non-exit would have changed things in Europe. Remember, Yugoslavia was a fence sitter, going back and forth. You know, Khrushchev goes to Belgrade to apologize. You know, it's sort of kind of a honeymoon that collapses in '57 again, and then in the after 68, after 67, the Civil War, you know, Yugoslavia aligned very closely, tries to align the non-aligned movement with the Warsaw Pact, and then it comes around 180 degrees after the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia. So it's a fence sitter. So there's so many different variables now here. It's really hard to make an argument. I think some details and some chapters in my book would have changed, but not the overall course of the conflict.
Great, thanks. By the way, Tim, Hope, Pierre, feel free to chime in as you feel. I want to do a question that came over the chat by William Watkins. He says, I teach Cold War history to high school IB International Baccalaureate students. Students are asked to evaluate ways in which authors' views have been shaped by their country of origin and the time in which they live. Question for Professor Lüthi. What should a student say about you to answer that question? Thank you very much.
All right, quick answer. You know, originally I'm Swiss. I'm now a double citizen with Canada. I definitely think, you know, the fact that my background is one of a very small and one of the middle power really has shaped the way I actually approach the question. I was shaped by the Cold War with on the mother's side an East German family. Remembering my mother sending care parcels from West Germany to East Germany. We lived at the border to West Germany in Switzerland. This is the reason why I studied the Cold War. So this clearly shaped me in terms of the times I live. And the other thing is what probably shaped this book is the very fact, you know, that I do not live in the United States. That I'm not encountered with the constant discourse on American campuses about actually American exceptionalism, about the United States and the world. There is nothing like a Canadian exceptionalism. There's no debate, discourse about Canada and the world. Canada sees itself as a part of a wider world. And it really helped me to move away from a very dominant discourse, a superpower-focused discourse in historiography. So the very fact that I'm not in the United States, that I'm in Canada, and I have to confess also, I'm at a very old-fashioned university, and I hope my university doesn't hear that, that actually gives me time to write a big book. And that really makes a difference, you know. So I have to praise, to a certain degree, the old-fashioned nature of my institution.
Thank you. Why don't I pose that question to the other panelists as well? I'm sort of curious. Hope, how has your national background and these times affected your work? Hope, Pete, please unmute Hope.
Okay. Well, I guess, can you hear me? For me, I was a graduate student at Columbia at the end of the Cold War, and, you know, but felt I grew up during the Cold War. And so I always wanted to understand the Soviet side, since I was in the US and they were, you know, the Kremlin this, the Kremlin that. So I wanted to know more about that. And, you know, I essentially was first trained as a Kremlinologist and learned Russian to try to understand what, you know, the other side of the Cold War, and was so excited when, due to the Cold War International History Project, I was able to join others in the archives in Moscow in the 1990s and finally read documents that ultimately explained why the Soviets and East Germans erected the Berlin Wall in 1961. So I guess also growing up in the West, I was curious to know how much room for maneuver was there in the communist bloc, and in my case, between East Germany and the Soviet Union. You know, was it as monolithic as we in the West made it out? And of course, as my book, Driving the Soviets Up the Wall, makes clear, you know, it wasn't as monolithic as we had thought. And of course, Lorenz takes that, you know, so much farther with this wonderful book.
Great. Tim and Pierre, do you guys want to just in a nutshell sort of say how you're coming to this? What's your...
Well, I think Pierre and I might have a similar explanation, but I won't speak for Pierre. I grew up in Canada. I think growing up next to the United States gives you a remarkable perspective. You both absorb, most Canadians, at least then, used to live along the border of the United States and would watch American television. You grow up learning about the US view of the world, but because you're in Canada, you have a Canadian, which is Commonwealth view of the world, and you can see the differences. Now, they're not as dramatic as the differences would be from perhaps the French view of the world, or the Soviet view of the world, or the Chinese view of the world at the time, but it teaches you to be skeptical about perspective, particularly perspective of capitals. So that, plus the fact that my parents sent me on a school trip to Moscow when I was in elementary school with a group of Canadians, taught me the importance of learning about other cultures and other languages, and that's when I started studying Russian.
Great. Pierre, just real briefly, we have a bunch of questions still, so.
Yeah, so, you know, growing up, I didn't know anything about the world, but I was a big hockey fan, and I really liked the Soviet Red Army team, and because of that, I thought the Soviet Union was just a great country. I really did. And I bought, my first 2 cars were Ladas. And then, you know, I became a Vietnam specialist, but the thing is, very seriously, I found out about the Vietnam War through watching the second Rambo. So you know, I think sometimes you don't come with the baggage that Americans have when you approach certain problems. Then I went to Hawaii to study the Cold War under a Canadian, Professor Tim Naftali, who's right here. So it's, I think the question is really, really good. We really are conditioned by where we're from.
Great, thank you. Let me call on Jeffrey Herf. Jeff, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Lawrence, I looked at the table of contents of your book, which I have not read yet, and I see that you begin a discussion of the Arab-Israeli conflict in 1948. Do you discuss the years of 1945 to 1948 when the international discussion about the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine in post-British Mandate Palestine took place? And if you do discuss it, what is your view of those events? Because in those years of 45 or 46 to 48, the political coordinates of the Cold War in the Middle East and regarding Zionism and the Jewish state were just the opposite of what they became after the anti-cosmopolitan purges in 1949. So that's the question.
Thanks, Jeff. Lawrence?
Yeah, so this chapter says 1948, but I actually started the 1890s. So I have a very a run through these events, you know, about Zionism, the emergence of Zionism, Gurion as the leader actually of the Zionist movement in the 20s, or in the 20s and 1930s, views on the Palestinians. He is on record of saying in the 30s that Palestinians form a nation, but that the two national projects are basically in conflict with each other. So he's very aware actually of this issue and how this then leads actually to 48. Again, my attempt is to push the Cold War a little bit into the background, but you can't really do this, of course, because the United Nations is involved after 1945 to 1948. This leads to all kinds of issues on the Arab side. It almost splits the Arab League. I have an early chapter on the Arab League. So I'm very aware about the multiple angles of this story. It's just a chapter is not enough. You know, it is such an incredibly complex story, and to do justice to all sides is also very, very difficult. This is a minefield for everybody operating on this particular topic, and I try to write as careful as I could, as an outsider, actually, as a non-specialist as well.
Great, thank you. I'd like to call next on Matthias Fiebiger. Matthias, yeah.
Hi. So I have to introduce myself, I'm an assistant professor at Harvard Business School, and my question is about temporalities. Professor Lüthi, you date the Cold War in Asia as already beginning by the 1920s with the Chinese Civil War. So my question is, when does a national or regional conflict become a Cold War? And this, I think, leads to a broader definitional question about the nature of the Cold War at its most basic level. Was the global Cold War more than the sum of its parts, or was it somehow perhaps less? Thanks.
Well, thank you. This is one about temporality, but also about definition, right? And about geography, ultimately. I used the term Cold War only starting in the fall of 1925 because that's when it was coined, you know, and I tried to avoid it before. But ultimately, since I started in World War I, in many respects, you know, there is this ideological conflict. It's a three-way conflict, in fact, as I argue. One between imperialism, communism, and capitalism, in fact, and it's a three-way conflict. And I see, in fact, communism as a challenge, a revolutionary challenge, and capitalism as a kind of a reformist, actually, challenge. This goes back to Wilson, and we have now heard about Wilson a lot. And, you know, there's also my criticism of Wilson, and then, you know, Roosevelt's Wilsonianism. But this sort of sidetracks the question. 1927. You know, this is really, the book is entitled Cold Wars, and the whole point is sort of to get away from this global view of the Cold War and see these as regional conflicts, maybe even national conflicts. If you see this as, in fact, an ideological first three-way and a two-way conflict, then, of course, 26, 27 is really the first Cold War. And I have to be frank, I stole it from Pierre Paquet, who brought this up in his book. This was mentioned actually earlier by one of the panelists, I think it was Pierre. It's really important, you know, to sort of see that this is the Cold War in action at the national level, married to the issue of decolonization and state formation. And many cases we have in this book are in fact about modern state formation. It's China, it's Vietnam, it's Africa, several places, maybe even Poland and the two Germanys undergo state formation way into the 1970s. So here it becomes really difficult in terms of temporality and definition to draw clear lines. And by design, I kept them actually.
Thank you. Next is Yafang Shah. Yafang?
You have to unmute.
Unmute yourself.
Yes. Okay,
there you go.
Yeah, Lorenz, congratulations on a major book. It's very impressive. I'm reading chapter 23, something about the end of the Cold War. So
wow, you made it that far. Thank you.
Oh, I jumped. Thank you. Did Reagan administration receive any credit in the peaceful end of the Cold War from your point of view? Because your mentor, John Gaddis, and some other scholars, they give much credit to Reagan. They believe that Reagan had the grand strategy. So what's your view?
Briefly, Lorenz.
Okay, thank you. So remember, I write actually that the Soviet-American conflict is not a boxing match that ends with Britain basically punching Gorbachev. It's a long-distance race in which the Soviet Union essentially runs out. And in that chapter you're reading, that's really the collapse of the Soviet Union ultimately. I really show how the structural changes that happened since the 50s now come together to make the Soviet project an unviable project. Right? Reagan definitely is important. I think he pushes the Soviet Union, but he's not central in the story at the end of the Cold War, in my view.
Great, thank you. Finally, I think that will be our final question. Fernando Zambrana.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, thank
yes,
you
we
very
can
much.
hear you.
Well, I'm a Bolivian high school student, and I'm pretty interested in history, but I wanted to insist a bit on Latin America. I mean, I understand that Latin American issues were not as important as, I don't know, Korean War or Vietnam War. But if we're talking about like some, like I was thinking of Cuba, like the Cuban Revolution did have an impact on international Cold War. So I wanted to, yeah, a bit insist on the role of Latin America in the Cold War.
Okay. Lawrence, once more on Latin America.
Just to reassure you, the Cuban Missile Crisis is of course in there. I mean, in the chapter on nuclear weapons, it's in there. In the non-aligned chapter, Cuba is a very crucial in the late 70s and the 80s, the way it shapes and to a certain degree undermines the non-aligned movement, so it's there. I have to say, if I had included actually Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, I have traded on very thin ice. The book is already so big, also a little bit outside of the argument of the book. I have been asked that I should add 3 chapters. I decided not to do it. The book is supposed to start a debate about what's the role of the middle and the smaller powers in the Cold War. How can we tie them in? And if this sparks a debate, and I've seen that people have published on this, there's a new book I just read, an edited volume, The Cold War in Latin America. I think this debate is already happening. This is a contribution to this debate, to decentering the Cold War. Unfortunately, you know, Latin America and Africa are less prominent in this particular book, but this is largely related to the basic argument about structural change.
Thank you. Let me turn it over to Eric Arnesen for some concluding remarks. Eric.
Thank you, Christian. I unfortunately have to draw this to a close, and our apologies to those who wanted to ask questions but couldn't because of time. Thank you to Lorenz, Hope, Pierre, Tim, and Christian for this terrific exchange. And let me mention in closing that we hope you come back for upcoming sessions on July 27th, August 3rd, and August 17th. So please join us next Monday, July 27th, for a webinar with University of California, Berkeley historian John Connolly and his new book, From Peoples into Nations, A History of Eastern Europe. Till then, take care and stay safe.